Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show, Dave Emmons and a Strange Reality. And this is where we talk about all kinds of topics. So we have a mixed topic. People ask me, well, what do you talk about? Well, I talk about a little bit about everything: science, archaeology, biblical history, world history. And, we get into a lot of that, what's going on in the world. And we might be getting into that today. I have a guy he's been on the show before. And the last time he's on, you liked him. I hope this time that, we get more views this time, that things seem like they're freeing up a little bit. Hopefully, but we have this gentleman, Mark Olly. He's from the UK, and there's nothing he hasn't done. And he's a little bit like me, except he's more skilled at what he does. he's he's had a very varied background, and I want to welcome Mark Olly to the show again. And of course, he's a jolly guy and a musician, and that's another reason why I like him so much, because he plays in bands. He's a drummer, and he still drums, and he still plays hard rock music and the like. So on the Strange Reality, I have Mark Olly. He's an internationally recognized author, TV producer, presenter, writer, lecturer, broadcaster, musician, and artist. He is a visiting lecturer at Winslow Guild and a University of Chester, heads up his own archaeological unit, and runs a DVD production and props company, Mythco. And he lives in the UK. And he's a drummer. He drummer for Copperworm, and now he's drummer for Wolf. And he's a session musician, so he gets around quite a bit. Most of us, I'm a drummer too, and most of us drummers, so you don't know if they're going to be there or not one week from the next.
Yeah.
They're flighty. They've always been known to be flighty, but I don't think Mark Olly's flighty. Are you, Mark? Welcome to the show.
No, I'm not. I'm not. The only thing you missed out is because he's here.
Oh, the
Hey,
kitty
I'm
cat.
an owner of a kitty
Yeah,
cat. There you go.
he's a
And
big one.
yeah, he is. He likes doing interviews. He really does. He's
Really.
international. So
Yeah.
there you go. For first appearance on the show.
There
There
you
we are.
go. Okay.
Stampy. You have
Okay.
Stampy.
He looks almost the size of the kitty cat I had. I had one that weighed about almost 19 pounds. And
Well, the biggest one I had, I don't know how it converts into metric, but it was a couple of cats ago. I had a crossbreed with a wild cat over here, and he weighed 3.5 stone, which is about the same weight as a small child. He was ridiculously big, crossed with a Maine Coon. So if you imagine what these big fluffy
yeah,
Maine Coon cats are like, imagine one of those. I mean, he would have filled the screen.
oh, that
You
would have
wouldn't have been
been
able to see me.
that would have been a good defensive cat that you.
Yeah, he is. He was
Yeah.
amazing.
Uh,
Yeah.
Now Mark has quite a few books. I think he last time we talked, it was only 2 or 3 months ago. He had about 9 or 10 books. Now he's probably got about 20. No, I'm just
No, nah. I mean,
uh,
normally I do a book about one every 3 years, but
yeah,
because of lockdown, because of the hiccup, I ended up doing 3 books in 1 year. So that's never happened before. So
right.
I'm still at 9, but there's another 3 in progress. I've
Good.
got
Yeah.
quite a few more in progress.
Yeah, we talked about that on the last show, and we talked about Europe's Roswell, that
Yeah,
UFO crashed at you have to Senate. Uh,
Aberystwyth,
uh,
Aberystwyth. Yeah,
okay, I have trouble with those kind of words.
it's Welsh. That's why, dearie
Yeah,
me, we
yeah,
have we have trouble with that.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
so, but no, I have trouble with quite a few words. The older you get, it's like you
Yeah.
move the way you want it to, and that's why I get in trouble with the wife all the time.
I was going to say it's a lot easier for me to say words nowadays because I've got less teeth.
No, but
Oh dear.
no, it's good to have you on and
Yeah. Yeah.
talk about what we thought we're just gonna wing it today, people. So
Yeah.
on the Strange Reality Show, we're gonna wing it today, and because Mark, he's got all kinds of topics that he's written about and he's talked about, and I'm sure he's had in his conferences. So I think what we'll talk about now, Mark, the internet is flooded with past history being totally wrong, and the starting of our human existence started some 4.5 billion years ago, they're saying, with our DNA. And they're putting out all kinds of misinformation and disinformation on the internet, and I just don't like it. I don't like it when somebody says, well, Yeah, we're gonna, next week about the 20th or 24th, we're gonna have chaos in this country. Lights are all gonna be out. Every time they say that, months go by and nothing ever happens.
Nothing happens.
Yes, don't listen to these people, people. Uh, but what we're gonna talk about is like Mark's into the world history and everything. Uh, Life before the Great Flood, Mark. Could you let us in on that?
Yeah, it was interesting because obviously we've emailed and you suggested the idea of tackling this whole idea of, what was life like before the cataclysm that created the world that we're in now.
Right.
Of course, getting out there, getting off to a good start, there have been several of those cataclysms. I'd venture to say that the last one was the famous Tunguska explosion in Russia, where it would appear that we had something akin to a comet that entered the atmosphere, exploded over Tunguska, and flattened all these trees. And it's still the same out there now. All these trees are flattened in different directions. But that seemed to be an aerial burst of something that was breaking up as it came in from the atmosphere. I'm not really going to get into what it may or may not have been. It may have been a cometary thing coming in,
Yeah, there's
or it could have been
some
could have
signs.
been a meet.
Yeah, UFO. There's some on
Well,
it.
yeah, UFO. Some people say it's that. Some people say it's a meteorite or whatever. But the main thing was the effect, and the effects were quite dramatic, and it wasn't very big. That's the key to it all. It was probably only the size of a football,
Mhm.
whatever it was. But then that is just one of many of those kinds of impacts. Now, there's some famous meteorite craters. There's loads of meteorite craters all over the place, but the ones that people tend to miss, which are really important, the two real, like the key meteorite craters. One is the entire of the Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
That is, that is a meteorite. That's what it is. That's why the Yucatan Peninsula is completely flat, because it's right adjacent to an enormous impact. Now, the one that they always call the dinosaur killer, the one that created a nuclear winter for 3 years, that is thought to be that one in the Gulf of Mexico. So that in itself gives us a kind of a marker, if you like. What was there after that? What was there before that?
Mhm.
And then it raises the question: was that meteorite responsible for the flood? Was that the flood stories? Did that trigger that off? But then you've also got, and this is the latest one, the United States Antarctica survey, which they've only done over the last couple of decades. They decided they were going to have a look at what was going on below the ice in the South Pole. So basically, they used powerful advanced radar to try and map the solid masses below the ice,
Right.
and they got a bit of a shock because below Antarctica is another crater 4 times bigger than the Gulf of Mexico. So big, in fact, and this is only a theory, but it's certainly a possibility that something could have struck the bottom of the planet. So imagine it's a ball and
Mhm.
it's taken the bottom off the planet, and that piece that it's taken off, they're actually saying that could potentially be the moon. There's
Yeah.
enough debris. Yeah, there's enough debris that's come off the bottom of the planet that's then stuck in the atmosphere, that's gathered together to form. Because the moon, of course, isn't a planet. It's not even a planetoid. It's a satellite. It's stuck onto to us, and it's going round with the same face facing us all the time. Um, Goodness only knows what an impact of that scale, would have done. Because clearly the way life seems to operate is you kind of got a lot of life and then it gets an impact and then it's less life and then it gets another impact or it gets another extinction event and then life reduces again. Then you get another one and it reduces again and so on and so on and so on. We don't know over how long a period how many of these impacts have happened, but what is clear is that somebody somewhere was around when it happened. We seem to be the constant, if you like. There's certain species and flora and fauna and what have you that seem to have always been there.
Right.
Um,
Mark, you mentioned something about Antarctica that it
mm,
just clipped the bottom of the earth off. Now, that kind of reminds me of all the talk that's going on about the flat earth. I mean, is it too early to ask you about the flat Earth theory? Because
No,
it's
no, it's
all over the
you know
internet, Mark. Yeah.
it's all over the place. Am I a supporter of flat Earth and the ice wall and all that sort of thing? Not really. I don't think that we're dealing with a flat Earth. I don't think we're some kind of disc world flying in space. I don't think that's the case. But on the other hand, what about hollow Earth? I don't think the planet is necessarily as straightforward as we think it is. And there is a conspiracy in that. I mean, you have a look at some of the maps that have been produced over the years, and clearly Africa is enormous. It's huge.
Right.
And what they tended to do was increase the size of Europe and that sort of area and decrease the size of Africa. But in reality, it's bigger. A lot of the space imaging, satellite imaging, has proven that the land masses are quite different from the traditional cartography. So there is a sort of an attempt there to reduce some parts of the world at the expense of increasing others, which is in itself a conspiracy.
Are you
But whether
saying,
and
are you saying, Mark, this is where history starts getting it wrong? Uh, who's
uh,
doing this? Who's doing all this topography and kind of decreasing sizes? You mentioned that they who
yeah,
who's doing this? Who's rewriting
uh,
history, Mark?
you've got different people doing different things at different times. I can give you an example. For example, the Piri Reis map appears to show Antarctica with no ice on it. So the argument is that the source for that is extremely old. What they're saying is that the Vikings, had access to the Piri Reis map, and that in fact that's where the source material is coming from. But actually, that is cartographers out in the Islamic world who had libraries that they could go to. They created a lot of maps that people like Columbus were using, and the Spanish and people like that. So the maps are older, they go back a lot further, but exactly where they come from and how old they are and what we knew about the planet, going back as far as that, you are now starting at that point to drift into Atlantis and Mu and Lemuria and lost knowledge and lost technologies from the past. Um, I think they knew what they were doing. I mean, if you can total up the whole of the landmass on planet Earth and decide you're going to stick the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau right in the middle, because it is literally right in the center, dead center of all the landmass, then clearly you have to know how big the landmass is, and you've got to know where it is in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, I know
Um,
you've seen these drawings that people are coming up with, trying to change history, or they're trying to rewrite it right now. Is the Great Ice Wall? We're talking about Antarctica, and that Great Ice Wall.
mm.
Do you believe in anything like that? Uh, and also they have military bases there, of course, and there's a few people coming out whistleblowing about what's the military is doing there. But is there an ice wall, Mark, there around the Antarctica?
I don't think we're looking at an ice wall because I still think we're looking at a ball, but there's no reason why the ball might not have some kind of openings at top and bottom. That may or may not be a possibility. There's a lot of evidence floating around of people that have said they've flown over it and they've seen it, etc. Antarctica is an interesting one. It's probably the only place on planet Earth that's not been trampled. It's relatively virgin in its nature and its outlook. And that's why a lot of military, etc., ends up heading down that way because they've got the space, and they've got the clarity and they can do what they want to do down there. What exactly they're up to is probably the reason why they're not telling us anything. What's going on down there. It's clearly something that's above top secret. But at the same time, you've also got to, let's be sensible about this. They don't want it wrecking. They don't want the place destroying. It'd be so easy to pollute it and environmentally, um, and it's pretty important. The kind of the poles, the ice at both ends is quite crucial to the functioning of the whole planet. Your
Right.
tides, your climates, everything are all controlled by the static ice. I mean, one thing I can throw in the melting pot at this point, literally melting pot, is that, the northern hemisphere, the ice does appear to be decreasing. At which point everyone goes, oh, it's global
Right.
warming,
Yeah.
whoa, panic,
Yeah.
But then they neglect to mention that the last couple of years, the amount of ice down on the other end, Antarctica, is 3 times the size it's been in the past. So at the end of the day, you've still got the same amount of ice, if not more so, and sea levels haven't altered. The
Right.
sea
Yeah.
levels are still exactly the same.
Yeah, it's just exchanging from one end to the other. And
It's going from one end to the other.
yeah, that's what I'd like to talk about. There's been so
Mhm.
much misinformation, disinformation. I know, Mark,
Yeah,
you're a real, basic. You have good ideas. You have good teachings. You
yeah,
have good background, and you could probably make sense or put in some common sense about all this wild stuff that's going on, all the
yeah.
speculation, conspiracy. Uh, but also with Antarctica, it's still unknown. Do you think that there's UFO bases there, like they've been saying, Mark?
Well, that hangs on your definition of what a UFO is. Are they developing technology down there? And the answer is probably yes. I'd be in favour of them getting up to doing stuff down there that perhaps we don't know about. But that technology, it won't just be how to, throw a metal disc into the sky. They'll also be looking at things like genetics. They'll be looking at how the planet functions. They might have they've created an ark where they're trying to bring all the seeds and the genetics for all the different species into one place where they can freeze it all and preserve it all and look after it in case anything cataclysmic does happen to the planet again. Which at the end of the day, knowing what I know about history and geology and archaeology and mythology, sooner or later something's going to happen. They're not wasting the time doing that. The hope is that they know what I know and that they do a good job of it and they get it right. And, this time it survives. I believe they do call it the Ark Project. I think it is an Ark Project.
Yeah.
So,
Is
but
that also Greenland? I saw something about Greenland having a seed where they put these seeds
yeah,
in.
that's the seed bank. That is a specific seed bank. I wasn't sure if it was in Greenland or if it was closer to the North Pole, but yes, certainly that's there. But I think they're doing something very similar in the South Pole. Nowadays, knowing what I know of technology generally, though, it's probably more to do with something to do with genetics, but it could also equally as well be to do with the electrical structure of the planet.
Mhm.
Because if you can get to the poles, the poles are wandering as well. They're moving. They don't stay in one place like we used to believe that they did. So exactly where the pole is now in Antarctica, I'm not sure what the coordinates are, but I'm sure that has something to do with it as well. They can mess about with the magnetism and gravity and the electric currents, implicit in the planet.
Mark, you
I'm sure
mentioned
that.
something about we don't know what our Earth is made up of. It could be hollow. Do you think there's an entrance to the inner world in Antarctica that they're not telling us about, Mark?
Well, there are people that believe that. I've got to say that, and there have been photographs in the past. Because I'm going to say that the ones that haven't been doctored, mess with. They're not AI. They're not digital. There's been hard copy photographs taken of something that does appear to be an opening. That having been said, though, it doesn't come up on Google Earth. So people are saying, oh, it's been blocked out, But there's no satellite images of holes and openings and things like that. I also did a book about crystal skulls and human heads,
Mhm.
and that looks at a thing called Olson's paradox, which is the way that the planet functions. And what they did ever since they've had computer technology, they've had a model of the planet and the expectation of how that model should work. For example, if it has an iron core, what happens if we stick iron in the core of the planet? How does it function? Well, the short answer is it doesn't. So the planet is not full of molten metal. That's not how it works at all. So what they did, that's Olson's paradox, to try and solve that and to try and get this computer model to work the way the planet works. Sooner or later, somebody came up with the idea of silica, which is quartz, basically. So they replaced the center of the planet with quartz. And then they went a little bit further when they started to go, oh yeah, this looks like it's working. This is quite positive. And they actually put in amethyst. which is a specific type of quartz silica. And lo and behold, they solved Alston's paradox. They have this computer model now of a planet that actually works. So what the reality is that we're sat on a crystal ball. We're sat on a gigantic ball of quartz silica flying through space. We're literally riding a giant crystal ball,
It,
or so
where,
it would appear.
where does all the heat come from? The lava and from the earth and everything. Mark,
Well,
is it?
it doesn't rule out the possibility that the quartz silica is still in a molten state.
Mhm.
I mean, everything's moving as well. So from a geological point of view, you've got all these big plates. The tectonic plates are floating around, and as they float around, obviously they're rubbing, they're generating a lot of heat with what's below them. And then you've got this lava layer. So between the plates and your core, you've got this liquid layer. Everything's floating around on that. Back to an earlier part of the conversation, though, and this is quite important. The plates, continental drift, they're all drifting away from the Gulf of Mexico. So it's the same as you would if you had leaves floating on a pond
Mhm.
and you dropped a stone in the middle of the pond, whatever's floating is going to float away from
Right.
the impact spot. But it's exactly the same with the molten surface of planet Earth. It's all floating away very slowly, but it's floating away from the Gulf of Mexico. So that is pretty much the last impact we've had that's had any significant impression on how the planet functions.
What about the
Uh,
time? Was that 65 million years ago, Mark?
I was 65, 66. I can't remember exactly. It's around about 66 million, is what they're saying.
Right.
Um, Personally, okay, this is me personally, I have an issue with these enormously long time periods. I think being bluntly realistic about it, at the end of the day, we've invented the time scales, we've invented the science, and we've invented the analysis that's come up with these enormous figures. But in reality, we've only got, a long time ago, not so long ago, and relatively recent. That's all we've got to go at. So, people are coming along. I mean, the classic example was, oh, all these extinct species of this, that, and the other, but they have an annoying habit of turning up, like the coelacanth and things like that. These supposedly, dead, they're gone. And then you've also got the flip side of that. I mean, the one that springs to mind very recently was a bunch of students were on a dig in America over on the other side of the pond. And they were doing an archaeological dig and they came up with a triceratops horn. Now, nobody had told these students that you don't bother to carbon date a fossil because, oh, yeah, we know what they are. They're too old. They lived this, so many million years ago, whatever. Anyway, they carbon dated this horn and it came back at, I think it was 33,500 years.
Mm.
So you got this triple horned, shield faced dinosaur that was thought to have been way, way extinct before us. And it's thundering around at exactly the same time as us.
Yeah.
You're into the
There's,
same
yeah,
tongue,
there's actually
you know.
drawings like in Central America, South America on the caves with dinosaurs. These people have
Yes.
seen dinosaurs and they were able to
Well,
draw them out. And that is kind of like you're right. I think we did
yeah.
invent time because we
Yeah.
out there in outer space, there is no time really in a way.
No.
You
No.
might explain that better. But what about this timeline about history? Could you tell us a little bit about that? Do you think that we're not as old as they say we are? Like they say 260,000 years ago is when our DNA was manipulated into our human form that we have now. The Anunnaki, Sumerian race, they did all this. And then something like 65,000 years ago, there's another change to our DNA. And we were kind of like made into slaves digging for gold for these gods that come from space, and that was the Anunnaki. And then they talk about them coming back. These are things that they keep talking about, and then the giants during Noah's days. I know that's a lot to unpack, Mark, but
Hmm.
you want to start by chewing on that a little bit, or?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, there's two very obvious statements. The first one is everything that you've just questioned is bracketed by evolution. It's the idea that we evolve. But if you absolutely forget that, just scrap that and just pretend it never happened, if you actually look at the physical evidence, we're not evolving, we're devolving. Everything's decreasing. there's less of everything. It's a decay process. I mean, everything dies, it's part of nature. Well, that's happening on a massive scale. The number of species are dropping. I mean, I think there was 5 different species of birds, for example, went extinct just last year. And that's only looking at one branch of, species, which is birds. So overall, things are decreasing. So the actual physical evidence now means I think we can fairly certainly throw evolution out. But if you chuck evolution out, then a lot of those theories about, DNA manipulation and when different things emerged and all this, that goes out the window as well. That doesn't work either. I'm not ruling out that there was any kind of intervention because clearly, we can intervene now. So why couldn't he intervene in the past? So yes, that is a perfectly reasonable argument. So that's the first observation. First of all, get rid of evolution and start looking at the actual evidence. I challenge anybody to do that. It's going to be difficult because they cheat. They'll give a name to a fossil that has a modern day name. One's Latin and the other one's in modern English. It's the same thing. So they really are trying to make life difficult for you if you decide to go down that avenue. I've been down there for years, so I kind of know what I'm looking for. But you will find that what I'm saying is true in practice. And then the second thing to remember is that none of us actually know. Any of the species in the past, or any of these super beings, or the Anunnaki, or people that lived in Atlantis, or interdimensional beings, or whatever, however you want to label these guys, we're not them. We only have 70 years and 10 and a bit more if you're lucky. That's it. That's our allotted time. So in actual fact, if I came along and I went, do you know what, 480,000 BC, we had the Hoxnean interglacial, and and then all of a sudden everybody's head just goes. We're not wired to even understand what that statement means, So the truth of the matter is that the science side of it is incomprehensible. It's unprovable. It's actually, to the average man in the street, it's complete gibberish. We don't have the capacity to understand that. So if you put those two factors together, which in a sense gives you common sense, if 1 minute some guy comes along and says, hey, I've got a fossil fish, here's this fossil fish, I've just dug it out of this quarry, and the next minute you've got the same fish and it's swimming in the sea, then clearly that fish has not gone extinct. Therefore, that piece of rock cannot possibly be as old as you think it is. Right. It can't be, and the geological processes, I'll give you a brilliant story, beautiful story. Most people won't even know it happened. We had a bunch of geologists. So you're in a different science now. You're in the science of geology. And they noticed that up in Iceland, there was a volcano that was coming up out of the sea, and it was starting to build an island. So for a geologist, this is absolute gold. You're watching the creation of, a landmass coming up from Vulcan. There it is coming up. So they watched what was going on this newly formed island. And they said, we saw 100 million years of geological development in a week.
Yeah. Yeah, that's and Mark, I guess the biblical timeline, if you go to church and you hear them talking about it, pastors, they'll say the earth is only 6,000 years old and man lived with dinosaurs. That's biblical context, right?
Yeah, you're in a sort of middle ground. The biblical stuff's interesting. Clearly it's older. Okay, so don't stick at Bishop Ussher's, whatever it was, 4,600 BC for Adam. Forget all of that. The way he came up with that, the way the church came up with that, was just to add up all the ages in the Bible, and ta-da, you've got the answer. But the problem there is the Bible isn't linear. You can't do that. It doesn't add up. But the oldest book in the Bible, most people don't realize, the oldest account which Moses wrote down, it's not just the first 5 books. There's also the account in Job. And Job's really interesting because it's a conversation between a man and God, or a God, depending on how you interpret it. And God basically turns around to Job and he goes, hey, you're not going to believe what I've done. This is fantastic. Have a look at this. So you go through the entire creation, the same creation story that you got in Genesis. But then when you get to the end, there's an extra 3 chapters. And the extra 3 chapters at the end are very, very clearly talking about dinosaurs. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because these books were laid down, you know, in the BC period. The accounts were written in the Old Testament. So you're way, way back. You're 3, 4,000, 5,000 years ago when these accounts were written. And yet they're talking about discoveries about dinosaurs that we're only just making. They're predicting, Job is predicting things which are coming true. And I'll give you some examples of that. For example, the account talks about dinosaurs being able to communicate in a type of language. They could talk. Now, you're not going to get that out of the fossil record, or you would assume you weren't.
Mhm.
Excavations on the remains of velociraptors have come up with a voice box. That's what's in Jurassic Park. When they create that voice box and he blows on it and he gets the attention of the velociraptors, that's based on a fossilized voice box. And they could communicate. Yes, they had their own language. Yes, it's nothing like ours, but they could communicate on quite a high level. The accounts also say when they stood up and moved, they made a lot of noise, dinosaurs, because they were plated. Well, we're only just beginning to get the remains of fossils of the plating, of the skin and the panels, and it is very clear that they would have made a tremendous amount of noise. And then there's another type of dinosaur there that actually breathes smoke and flames. Everyone's like, whoa, it's got to be a dragon. Surely that's the prototype for a dragon. Well, what's really interesting, and this is mind-boggling, and this is absolutely the truth. People need to go and check out things called gastroliths. Now, there's a certain type of dinosaur that went around like a big chicken, picking up stones, and it kept it in a gullet like a chicken. So when it's eating food, these stones grind up the food. But not only are all of the stones made of flint, so the question is, how the hell does a dinosaur know which stone is flint? Not only are they all made of flint, which of course produce sparks when they bang together, but these dinosaurs have got weird vents in the heads. They appear to have some kind of, and early on they theorized this might be so the dinosaurs could make noise and they could signal to each other. But some people have said no, it's because they're basically walking compost heaps. So they've got this huge amount of methane gas building up inside the rotting material that's inside them. And what they do is they bang these stones together to spark and flame off the gas. It gets rid of the gas. Well, there you have it, smoke and flame. Now that's proper archaeology.
Yeah.
They've got the gastroliths. I mean, I've got two of them in my collection. These big lumps of flint.
Yeah. I want to remind
Uh,
you, Mark's also an archaeologist, and that's how he gets into a lot of this. But
and
it's
geologists as
amazing,
well. Yeah,
geologist, yeah. But it's
yeah,
amazing that concept of the rocks and the gas
yeah.
and things.
And it's in the Bible. And that's the other kicker as well. You've got this whatever this God being is chatting away to Job, and there's Job sat there as a human being. Oh yeah, I've seen one of those. Yeah, I know where that is. We got one of these flame blowing dinosaurs down at the bottom of the road, so I've seen one of those. Clearly, whoever Job was is familiar, so he's pre-flood. He must have been alive pre-flood, and that's where that account's coming from. Um, and then you've got other things like, I mean, they all try and ignore Porksley Riverbed in Texas, which is where you've got, dinosaur tracks and human tracks fossilized next door to each other. It always tickles me up with that because you can't quite work out if it's the dinosaur chasing the guy with the feet, or if it's the guy with the feet chasing the dinosaur. You're not quite sure who's chasing who, but both sets of tracks, go across this riverbed, and they're clearly from the same time period.
Right. And then also you get these theories, these stories, Mark, that the ETs come down here and they control this planet and they control who lives on it. Then they produce this as like a Noah's Ark. And what they do, they got rid of all the dinosaurs and let us mammals take over the earth because we could have never done it in a kind of a baby fashion with dinosaurs because they would eat us alive. We wouldn't be able to, you know, even
Nah.
start farming. What about that theory?
There's a certain amount of evidence that a huge number of dinosaurs that have always been assumed to be, predators, the meat eaters, basically went round cleaning up the rubbish. So when something died, they ate that. So they're more like, crows, they eat carrion. The idea of active killer dinosaurs, there's only a very small number of dinosaurs that seem to have those kind of predatory tendencies. And actually, there probably more of them live in the sea than they do on land, you know. But bear in mind, the fossil record is only a snapshot. You know, in some cases, we've only got one fossil of one particular dinosaur, or we don't even have a fossil for that. You know, they're just not there. They didn't survive. But it's clear that things didn't operate the way that we assumed in the past that they operated. You know, they weren't all eating each other all of the time, you know, and eating us. That wasn't the case. The idea as well that mammals have suddenly risen up since the days of excuse me, the days of the dinosaurs. That isn't true either. All the nice furry, you know, big animals that were around, you know, after the flood are dying as well. They're all going extinct, you know, you name it, pandas, you know, whatever. There's so many of them just going one after another. You know, there's the marsupials and the mammals and things like that. We're just the last, you know. I mean, even human species, you know. I think we did this in Crystal Skulls and Human Heads, where if we've covered that, I think we covered
Yeah,
some of that.
we did cover
Yeah,
it.
we did. Yeah, yeah. You know, like it's only 400 or 500 years ago when the Paracas, the Nazca Paracas, these guys with the enormous heads, when they went extinct, you know. So even in our historical epoch, our time, we're losing them, you know. The little guys, you know, Homo florensis on Flores Island are recent extinctions, you know. They were trading Huns with huge heads, Hunnic ladies. In medieval times, they were trading them into Europe, you know. So it's only in recent times that they've all disappeared. And it's beginning to look like we're the warriors. You know, we're not here because we're intelligent. We're here because we're really good at fighting for survival. You know, so we've gone round wiping out the opposition. That seems to be the main reason why we're here from the archaeological record.
You know, I had a
Yeah.
guy on the show here. He talked about the pyramids, and we talked about human intelligence. I know you just mentioned a while ago that way back when,
Mm.
after Atlantis, there was enough human intelligence to build the pyramids, and
Mm.
the humans, not the ETs. He said humans. We don't give the humans in the past credit. They were very intelligent. They were taught by
Yeah.
ETs at first in the very beginning, and they passed this on. And that's why only the elites and the high priests would know this knowledge, and they would teach the workers how to do this stuff. And they
Yeah.
did. They use frequencies and sound waves in order to lift things. And so we lost that. Actually, what you're saying is we dumb down. It-
Yeah, yeah, and most of the things we discover once we've discovered something, we tend to suddenly be amazed by the fact that we've rediscovered it. You know what I mean? Somebody somewhere else has already done it, and all we're doing is finding it again. You know, we're kind of blundering in the dark. You know, picking objects out of a black closet. You know, we're just pulling at past technology. And again, these guys with the enormous heads were in Egypt. You know, you look at the Akhenaten dynasty with their huge heads and what have you. Clearly, they were in Egypt. And whenever you've got these guys with the big heads, they seem to take positions of authority. So clearly, they are, you know, far in advance of us. You know, they're beyond our capabilities. I would love to have sat down with, you know, one of the Nazca Paracas and, you
yeah,
know, 400 years ago and had a really good chat with one of those guys. They really could teach us a thing or two.
no.
Yeah, so building a pyramid for a team of them would be a walk in the park. Plus the fact they were building the pyramids, everybody forgets this. There were still woolly mammoths.
Yeah,
The woolly mammoths were still alive when they were building pyramids. You know, they overlap.
yeah. And they said
Yeah,
something like they went extinct, what, about 7 or 8 thousand years ago, somewhere in there. Uh,
yeah, the last ones. Yeah,
but the intelligence of humanity throughout history was they were very intelligent. And
yeah.
that what's happening now, they're rewriting history. And do you believe in the carbon dating concept or the other dating concepts, the laser concepts of dating? Do you think they're accurate, Mark?
Well, the technology. I'm not going to take argument with the technology because that's been refined over a long period of time. Although I do have to say again, this is the thing. They assume that carbon decayed at a regular rate. So that's how they calibrated the original carbon dating, carbon 14. Then they come face to face with reality because you've got bristlecone pine trees which live as long as that carbon dating process. When they started dating the tree rings, they suddenly discovered that carbon does not stay constant. It peaks and then in other times it drops. So using the bristlecone pine trees, they recalibrated the carbon scale. But that then cocks the whole thing up. All the previous dating that they did that was, yeah, we got science, this is all fixed. All of a sudden it falls apart in the face of reality. So that's kind of where I was going when I said you've got to be very careful what time scales they're using.
Right.
Because, the rate of atomic decay, and carbon decay and all this sort of thing, those kind of decay rates, a lot of them are assumed. The best example I can give you, it's a bit frivolous, but I did this to my geology lecturer when I was in college, because 1 minute in this particular class, he stood at the front of the class and he's geological timescales. He said, we date the fossils and all that by the rocks that we find them in. And then a bit further on, a bit in the lecture, about an hour or so later, he said, and of course we date the rocks by the fossils that we find in them. So my hand went straight up and I said, whoa, wait a minute. You're dating the fossils by the rocks, but you're dating the rocks by the fossils. And then he stopped it and he just went, right, you're going to have to see me later for me to explain how that's the case. The bottom line is that the dating they used to use, I was in the 1970s when I was being trained up, was based on Victorian ideas that were basically wrong. Okay, so like the idea is that things fall in nice layers, and therefore the stuff near the top's the youngest and the stuff at the bottom is the oldest, is not true.
Right. And
You know,
also with
it's
all this disinformation and misinformation, people are making up things in the internet. And
oh that yeah,
they send me they send me these postings, and I tell them, I said, look, this needs to be vetted. This may not be true at all. And the timelines and the intelligence of the people in the past, ancient humans,
mm,
they were very intelligent, and they were taught by the ETs some years ago, not just recently. I mean, or not just in the last 2,000, 3,000 years, but they were taught many years ago by the ETs, and these elites knew this. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, interesting comment he made back in 1898 to 1902. He was our president back in that time. He said, "There's nothing new under the sun." So
yeah,
he was an elite, and he
yeah.
knew.
Winston Churchill said the same. He said, "The further backwards you look, the further forwards you'll see."
Right, right.
So it's basically the same thing by implication.
So
Um,
the elites know this stuff.
mm,
They're in these groups that are above us, and it's like the high priest thousands of years ago. The smart ones, the intelligent ones, are the ETs that started things out thousands years ago. They didn't want to deal with the humans, the populace. So what they did is they invented these high priests. They'd give them the knowledge, and they would control the people. And so that's how that all started. This elite status, they kept it within their own little groups, and now you got the cabal and deep state. This is for entertainment purposes. I just want to mention that, but these are modern day groups that
yeah,
that they're supposed to have this knowledge over us, and they don't let it out. And that's the reason why disclosure is just kind of trickling, and
yeah,
it's not coming all the way out, because the powers to be, even above the military and even our governments around the world, they are saying, no, we don't want to get this released right now, because we're utilizing that technology ourselves, and we don't want the regular peons to know what we're using. So is that going to get me in trouble? That's just for entertainment purposes, platforms, whatever. But I believe that, yeah, history has been there's been resets. You've heard the word reset, Mark.
yes,
You,
yes.
you on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's clear evidence of periods of time when things were not as previously presented. Best example of that's probably pyramids. Pyramids are everywhere, literally. You can't really pick a country or a continent or whatever that hasn't got a pyramid on. And they're pretty unique. They have a fairly consistent design. There's doorways a certain shape, windows a certain shape, steps, certain areas around them. It's an overall concept. It's not just, let's stick something up that's triangular. It's not as basic as that. There's a bit more to it. And they all seem to be going in the same direction. They all seem to have the same basic kind of functions. Excuse me. And they're everywhere. They're all over the world. So clearly, clearly there's some kind of communication going on everywhere, and some of these pyramids, potentially they could be under the ice, they could be under the sea, they're all over the place. Excuse me. Clearly there's a connection.
Right.
Ancient races are connected, but that's been covered up. It's only the internet's not all bad. Excuse me. Some of the information that's coming out by communication, is opening up these doorways that have previously been closed. As soon as you start looking at things like that, oh boy, is that a big rabbit hole. I'd encourage people to start looking at these correspondences. If there's any doubt about what we're talking about, if you don't believe in pre-flood civilizations, you don't believe in, the ancients going all the way back to the end of the last ice age and things like that. If you don't want to go down that avenue, forget all of that and just look at the evidence, evidence. Go and have a look at what's physically out there, and you'll be absolutely blown away. It's all over the world. Clearly the Egyptians knew a thing or two. That's not a bad place to start. They seem to have most of the separate elements as part of what they're doing. But there's depictions of boats everywhere. The same prehistoric tools appear everywhere. There's guys with the stretched heads appear everywhere. Pyramids and architectural phenomena, that's all over planet Earth. Megalithic and monumental structures, that's all over planet Earth. The knowledge of the stars, everything from, Stonehenge all the way. They turn up everywhere, these megalithic structures, and they're all based on the same thing. And then right across planet Earth, mathematics is relatively uniform. You can find things that are the same everywhere. And clearly that means all of that must have existed at some point when people were talking to each other in the past, and then they get all these Victorian history books, everything written over the last couple of 100 years that just rubbish that, the idea that, these Africans were primitive and, we never went to America before Columbus, nobody knew that. And
That's
all these, ridiculous ideas. I think they've now, even using, semi-historical, timescales, they've got footprints in America of people that cross the frozen land bridge, across from sort of Russia. They've got that going back to 23,000 BC, 23,000 BC. So clearly, the more recent, by recent, I mean, that's worth defining what that is. Most of the evidence we've got to play with is after the Ice Age.
right. And we're talking about Columbus didn't discover America when they decided
No.
to take Columbus holiday away. I have no objection to that because even on Oak Island, that TV series that we have here in the States, they have found things, artifacts and coins that go back BC, 200 to 300 BC.
Well, I always say this. There's an archaeologist called Barry Fell. In the 1970s, he wrote a book called America BC. And when it went into print, it was just instantly banned, because he tells you that there's Roman shipwrecks out there, there's Egyptian hieroglyphs out there, there's prehistoric remains, megalithic structures. The Phoenicians were out there, the Irish were out there, the Vikings were out there, medieval folks made it over there. They're just, constant people going across, and they just wanted to cover that up. 1970s, they didn't want to know. They didn't want to.
Yeah, if there were books written, they burned them up. They
tried to get rid of them, but you can still get that book on Amazon. It's still available secondhand, but it's called America BC by Barry Fell, and that's where it all begins. It begins with that book. He really does start to, unravel and unpack that whole false narrative. He deals with
where
it.
did he get his information, Mark? This guy
Physically. That he physically went out and visited sites and surveyed them, and he wrote down the inscriptions that he found, and he talked to locals, he talked to farmers and residents, and because he was an archaeologist. This is the thing about archaeology: we're very kind of, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then shoot, it's a duck. Show me. It's all about show and tell. There's no point coming up with all these fancy theories and, this, that, and the other, and what have you. No, as an archaeologist, we go with the evidence. That's evidence. There's the word, evidence. That's what we're dealing with. And it's got to be reasonably reliable evidence. As you say, there's a lot of nonsense being, kicked around on the internet.
Right.
People just join dots that should never have been joined up, and they come up with, all kinds of things. Anything's possible now with AI and CGI and all this kind of thing. It's creating a very, very difficult world to navigate.
Well, that brought to my mind when I was talking to this one particular person, and I've talked to you too, and this
Mm,
is where I form, my thoughts, hearing people like you, experts in this field, and they talk about these people that were very intelligent. I said this a while ago,
mm.
and they didn't need to have ETs, show them how. They've already been shown. It's like they taught them these lessons thousands of years in advance, and these are smart people. But getting to that, we talked about Atlantis,
Mm.
Lemuria, and Mu. Could you tell us a little bit about those civilizations?
Well, that was perhaps one of the good things that came out of the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. This guy called James Churchward looked into Mu as being something that was in one part of the world. Atlantis, that's another part of the world. Lemuria, that's another part of the world. There are more. There's kind of all kinds of continents all over the place that vanish below the sea. Now, the beauty of that is twofold. Clearly, when the Ice Age came to an end, there was more water. It's not rocket science. The ice gets less, the water gets deeper. So you then end up with areas being inundated. And the second part of that is we can find them. They're actually there. Any major continental mass, you can go just off the coast and probably about 30 meters down, you're going to hit another layer of archaeology. So it's clear, it is very clear that at some point, a great deal more water entered the ecosystem and the sea went deeper. But we've got proof of that. We know where we're going when we're dealing with ice age and what have you. We've got the ice cores from the North Pole, possibly from the south as well. So we know what's going on climatically. You can navigate that back through time. So you know that these things happened, and then you've got the physical evidence to prove that clearly it did happen. Because you've got the remains below the waves. So I have no problems with that. The different names that people have come up with, and the ideas about Atlantis and all the rest of it. Before we had ETs and all that kind of thing, before we were going off on UFO journeys, which we do now, before all of that, the big thing was to try and find out where Atlantis was. To go and search for that. And is it in the Bahamas, or is it in the Mediterranean, or is it a landmass somewhere on Africa, or whatever. I don't think anybody has actually completely pinned it down, but it wouldn't surprise me if we weren't far off. Capabilities now for doing deep sea exploration
Kind of people,
and satellite.
kind of people were they, Mark? The Atlanteans and the Lemurians. What kind of people were they? Where was their origins? Where did they get their start, Mark?
Well, you've only got to look at the physical evidence. When I did crystal skulls and human heads, all of a sudden I'm thinking, well, you got tiny little guys, that are fully mature and they're only 3'6" high. But then clearly at some point in the past, there's enough evidence to say we had giants, they could have been 30 odd, 40 odd feet tall, real, the big end of the spectrum. And that is exactly what you find in nature. There's a little tiny forest cat that will sit in the palm of your hand, the palm cat. But then if you cross a lion and a tiger, you get a liger, and it's a cat the size of a horse.
Mhm.
And there were some enormous cats. Go back to the fossil record, and they're huge. So you'd expect the same thing to be true of human beings. So when you're thinking in terms of ancient civilizations, you always get these CGI'd, these, computer generated images of things that look like angels, and they're all, 5'6". They're all white, blonde, blue eyes, shining with light with angels. No, no, absolutely no. Complete and utter nonsense. There was a diversity of humanity on a scale that we're not used to dealing with, black, white, yellow, red, tall, small, muscly, not so muscly, big heads, small heads, ugly, not ugly, whatever you want to, just huge, vast amount of diversity. So then already you're dealing with then cities and civilizations that don't fit our imagination. They don't fit the way we think of the past. Then throw dinosaurs into that mix. you know. So one minute you got some guy walking past and he's like 20 foot tall with this 3-story head, you know, that kind of long gangly, you know, looks like something out of Star Wars. And as he's marching past, you've got a brontosaurus rumbling past in the background or whatever, you know. Then it really does go off the Richter scale at that point, because you've got all this enormous biology. I think there's about, in the fossil record, there's about 35,000 different distinct species now. I think that's where we're at. But surviving on planet Earth, there's only about 18,000 species, you know, distinct branches that you would define as a species. 2/3 have gone. We've lost it. They've disappeared, you know.
You
Well,
mentioned giants, and in the Bible they mention giants in Noah's day. Jesus even said
yeah,
that you'll know the end of times when the giants come back, like they were in Noah's time at the end times. Now, these giants fossils, the skeletons, have been found everywhere around the world, and
yeah,
they're
they just try and cover that up because it blows the evolution thing completely out of the water.
who you think's covering that up? I heard of even out west back in 1880 or something, they found a giant fossils and skeletons, and there was some guys dressed in black who come up with the horse and carriage, and they loaded these skeletons up, and they said they was taking them to the Smithsonian Museum,
Yeah.
except the Smithsonian said they don't have them. So what's going on? Why are they hiding these skeletons of the giants? And here we go back. Well, we're still on the subject of time and
Mm,
going back in time
mm.
and getting rid of disinformation and misinformation. So who you think is responsible for hiding those giants from us, Mark, and why?
Well, different periods of time, different people have had different agendas. So I would imagine in America, it's going to be the Bible Belt. It's going to be the guys that are all biblical, that don't want something to come up that's going to upset the apple cart, that will upset the balance and give people a different impression of how things were. But the giants, you know, Goliath and all his brothers and what have you, they only died at the hands of David. Well, that's 1600 BC, you know, so that's not long ago. So they're relatively recent in terms of extinction. And again, if you go to the Victorian times, there were people who were 9 feet tall, 10 feet tall. You know, there's black and white photographs of giants, you know, all over the world. These real big guys. So the whole phenomenon of shall we say lesser giants, they've only died out relatively recently. You know, I kind of struggled with this when I was doing the book, whether to put a chapter in on it or not, because nowadays we view giants as being an illness. You know, giantism. We think it's some kind of genetic illness. But the argument is, what's the difference between a genetic illness and a genetic throwback?
Mhm.
Maybe once upon a time it wasn't an illness,
Right.
simply because there were more of them. You know, they were a race. And
Right.
what we're now left with is the trace elements in the DNA. And modern day science and modern day medical technology are identifying this as an illness, when in fact it might not be an illness, you know. It's the same with a lot of these things that have letters, you know, ODD, ADHD, you know, obsessive compulsive OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and all this kind of thing. Before the days when language and mathematics was so important, the things you could remember visually were the most important.
Right.
So all these guys wandering around now who are medical oddities or educational oddities or whatever, you know, who they're kind of, oh, you're on the autistic spectrum. Maybe once upon a time, the entire planet was like that. And there was only a small number of individuals that were obsessed with things like mathematics
Right.
and
Well,
order and structure.
I don't live too far from where
Yeah,
the world's tallest man, Robert Wadlow, uh,
exactly. Yeah.
and my mom ran into him in school, in grade school, whatever. She's 96. She's still living,
Yeah.
but she tells me the story about her meeting him on the sidewalk, her and a couple of her sisters. And he said they said he was really nice, spoke in a real deep voice. And she said the thing that she remembered about him most, and this is probably a woman's point of view, a lot of times, where she said he didn't smell too good. He was kind of dirty, I guess, because he couldn't take a bath too well because he's so big.
Yeah.
And so they had to take him outside and hose him off, I guess.
Well, the frustrating part of Robert Wadlow, of course, is the fact that when he was buried in a block of concrete.
Uh-huh.
They made jolly sure that we're never going to dig him up. We're never going to know. You know, we're not going to be able to analyze anything to do with him. He's in a sealed sarcophagus inside an enormous block of concrete. So I don't think we're ever going to dig him up anytime soon. So that's frustrating because, in a way, you could argue he's the last of the giants. You know, he really was the last of the truly enormous human beings. I think, was it 9'11" he grew to or something? Yeah.
He was actually about 9 feet. He was
Well,
eight.
he actually he died as well of an illness. He
Yes,
contracted flu when he was at a parade, and so he hadn't actually finished growing. He would have grown bigger than that.
there was an infection in his foot.
Yeah,
I guess because he couldn't, his feet were flat and he couldn't wear certain shoes.
that was it. Yeah,
An infection in his foot, and it's turned into staph infection. And back then, we didn't know how to control that too well.
no,
Back in the 30s and early 40s, so that's what he died from. But it was his
yeah,
giantism that caused that a low immunity. He didn't have a very good, immunity.
yeah.
Uh, Now, getting back, I know I kind of,
Which, hang on, let me just interrupt you just
yeah,
to conclude the Robert Wadlow story. It's interesting that what we were seeing in him in terms of illness, in terms of lack of capacity, and what we see in the Bible accounts speaks to a species that's dying out. That's what happens as part of the extinction process. You know, one of the guys in the Bible had 6 fingers and 6 toes
yes,
because genetically they're starting to, corrupt and interbreed and disappear and vanish and collapse. So that's also the science behind me saying, well, when does a distinct form of genetic species, when does that become an illness? When does that turn into a medical problem? And that's what we saw. That's what we saw with Robert Wadlow.
yeah.
Anyway, go on, crack on.
I was going to go back real quick and briefly about Atlantis and Atlanteans, Lemurians, and Amu. Were they ET related, or were they? And you talked about the big heads
Yeah.
in Central America. Were they ET related in DNA, or were they humans that were just very smart, like we were talking about a while ago, Mark?
Well, this is where you've got to define what you mean by an alien. I mean, the current thinking on aliens is that they are in some way interdimensional, that they are living and existing on a different plane at a different frequency from the frequency that we live on, which in a nice, convenient sort of way, that deals with this idea of communication. Is it alien or is it us? It kind of deals with that in a nice way. Because if you're going to argue that it's alien, if you're going to say, hey, it was some kind of alien that spoke to Moses on the mountain and all this kind of thing, you're dealing with cross-dimensional communication. So the fact that we got hit by a meteorite and everything sank below the sea is completely irrelevant to people existing in other dimensions. They're not going to be affected directly by that because they're coming from somewhere else. They're in a different plane of existence. They're in a different place. So moving that to one side, I'm not dodging the issue. What I'm saying is, yes, that's your aliens. So move that to one side. What you're left with is the physical remains of us from the past. So these guys with the enormous heads, and all the rest of it, that's archaeology. So clearly they did exist. They're not aliens. There is just a slight potential that some of the DNA could have been manipulated and messed with somewhere down the line. But what you are dealing with is a race of super beings who are essentially an offshoot of humans. That's what they are. They're more us than anything else. So I'm not ruling out the idea that aliens and humans are communicating and it's interdimensional, etc., etc. I'm not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I'm just saying that the physical evidence we've got sitting in museums, most of it, if not all of it, is us. It's us. And as you are kind of hinting, we're that's the baby that's gone out with the bathwater. Everybody, oh, it's alien this, it's alien, aliens built the pyramids, aliens did this, aliens did that. No, there are super beings, a lot of it is us. Yes, we could
Yeah,
build Baalbek, 30-ton blocks halfway up a wall. We could do all that because back then they knew how to do it.
yeah,
As
they
you
did.
mentioned it earlier, sound technology, light technology, all that sort of thing. Yeah, we were capable of doing that. And some of the people that are alive nowadays, to bring back into the issue of the elites, I think the elites, the people that are sort of controlling the show, they know that the past is absolutely nothing like the popular view of what the past is. The popular view is, yeah, we're all evolving, things are getting better, things can only get better, we're developing, we're going to be here forever, no worries at all, la-di-da, let's all walk around, it's all buttercups and roses. No, the reality is everything's actually dying. We're all going to die, none of us get out of here alive, and that's a fact. We need to face up to that as a good thing, not as a bad thing, because we're going from this dimension to the next dimension. The ancients clearly came to terms with that, in a huge way, in a really big way. And yes, there's just the possibility we could get smacked by an asteroid or a meteorite. It's not always going to be like this. It isn't going to last forever.
You
Some
mentioned
people
earlier,
will.
you mentioned earlier, Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt. You
No, it's
mentioned
all right.
about religion. And I think religion was invented to control us. And also taking away our ancient history is also a method of controlling us. And the elites or somebody knows all this technology and they don't want us to find out about it. So that's what we're talking about. I guess these big headed creatures, DNA populated, they were part maybe ET hybrid, you can call them. We're all hybrids, I guess you can say. I got about 5 or 6 different, DNA mixed in with me. I'm a mutt, I guess you might be more thorough English and English
Yeah,
person.
don't get me started on my DNA. We'll be here all night. But put it this way, I'm a little bit more, fixed than everybody else. But I'm Central European Celt, so that kind of, people want to go off and check that out. It's human. Don't worry about it. It's human, but there's a story there.
Yeah.
Maybe do that on another day.
The Celtics were
Yeah,
great people. I mean,
yeah.
people and very warlike people. In which I think what's going on in Ireland right now. I don't want to talk too much
Oh
about.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's this is for educational purposes, but there's a lot of I guess fighting strangeness going on there. But I look at all of this stuff that people like the elites who I mean, we have an idea who, like even the Pope, in Rome, uh, they have secrets that they're keeping from us. Is that right, Mark? You talked about that once before.
Um, yeah, I did mention it once before. I mean, I was talking to a chap this morning, and we came to the same conclusion. There's about 50 odd miles of shelving in the Vatican Library. There's enough there to keep 100 scholars going for 100 years. They'd still never get around to reading it all. So some of it, to some extent, it's not like a deliberate cover up. It's just they haven't got the foggiest idea where to find half the stuff. It's not catalogued. It's a mess. Doesn't look like it did in the Da Vinci Code. It's
Right.
quite funny. Anybody that knew anything about the Vatican Library, when he pushes all those shelves over in that glass hermetically sealed cabinet thing, and oh, we were all laughing at that. We were like, it's nothing like that. It looks more like a bookshop at the bottom of the road after a hurricane. It's
Yeah. Have you
crazy
seen
in
it?
there.
Have you visited?
I've seen bit. I've not been in there because I've not had the necessity to do that, but I am aware of what's down there. I've seen a lot of images of it and met a lot of people that have been in there, and they've just said, you don't want to go in there. It's chaos, absolute and utter chaos. They know where some of the significant bits are, but there's 2,000 years worth of stuff that's just been built up and built up and built up, over and over again. So some of the significant works, the really important stuff, they know where that is, but most of it is just who knows. I know this morning I was mentioning that they recently found this new library in Tibet. They took this wall down. There's like 10,000 boxes, with all these scrolls in, all written in ancient Tibetan. There's only a few people that can still read ancient Tibetan, but the gist of it, from the labels on these boxes, it seems to be the entire history of humanity, going right back to the beginning, all in scrolls, and that was only found like in the last couple of years. They haven't even begun on that. They're not even scratched the surface on that one yet. And both of those libraries are not unique. There's if you start to look into libraries, you look into documentation, there's libraries all over Africa, there's libraries everywhere, all over Russia. They're all over the place. The biggest problem is just finding someone who can read them. That's the bottom line.
What about the libraries like in Alexandria and there's another one I think in Greece
Yeah.
that actually the Christians burned down because they said it was evil. Just
Well,
like yeah,
three different sets of people burnt the library at Alexandria. I think the first one to burn it was when the Romans conquered the Greeks.
Mhm.
So I think the Romans had a pop at it. Then it was the Christians, they had a pop at it. But by that time, it had already been damaged by the Romans. And then the biggest damage was actually by Islam, the Islamics, when they came in. They were using the scrolls to fire bread ovens to feed the population because they couldn't read any of the scrolls. So there's been three different, kind of pagan, Christian, and then Islamic. Those three different sets of people. They just went through and destroyed them. But in defense of the library, we didn't lose everything. We only lost the scrolls that were in at that time for copying, because all the library scrolls at Alexandria were copies. They pulled all the information in from all over the known world, copied the scrolls, and then sent them back. So yeah, where did the ones end up that they sent back? That's a logical argument. Probably quite a few of those have finished up, in Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls, or with the Gnostics in the Nag Hammadi library, or maybe they ended up in the Egyptian libraries, somewhere in the temples, or they all eventually, finished up in the Vatican basement, the Vatican library. Who knows? Who knows where they all ended up?
They're saying there's a room there under the Sphinx in Egypt, and they said that
Uh,
there's might be a library there that could
Yeah,
explain.
that's what's his name? The sleeping prophet that came up with that. I can't remember his name now. It's gone out of my head. Yeah, the idea that there's going to be a library there that was found. Well, I've been to the Sphinx. I've seen some of the tunnels, and I've seen the footage from the archaeology going down the shaft below the Sphinx. Brings you to a big black empty sarcophagus and all these tunnels going off. But at the moment, currently, no library. There's no library.
Do you think the
So
Egyptian government's hiding something though? I heard that they have military there and
yeah, the bottom line is that they don't want all the treasures stolen, because when they had the Islamic uprising, the summer of whatever that they had, a lot of the archaeological sites were pilfered. They were attacked by treasure hunters. The military is to stop that. If you understand how Egypt functions, that's the guys in the green uniforms with the tanks and the jeeps. They're there to stop tomb raiders. Basically, that's what they're trying to prevent. And the authorities are dealing with the archaeology they've got as fast as they can.
the
They're
director
just doing the best they can.
the director of antiquities, what's his name? I've seen him a lot.
Zai Hawass.
Zai Huas, yeah. And he, if you go there and if you're doing any archaeological work or if you're a journalist, if you go there and mention ETs built this, you're out. You're out of the
Yeah,
country. They take you to the airport and you're gone
yeah,
because they're really high on this idea that the Egyptians built those pyramids. And
yeah.
now we're looking at maybe the intelligence that the ETs left for them some thousands of years ago was carried on and passed on from the elites down, and they knew how to do all this stuff. Maybe humans did do it, but they did it with technology that was taught to them. That's just like an ET. He would come to me and maybe in my kitchen, and he'd show me how to build a generator that could produce power for lifetime and probably fire up a whole city. And they teach me how to do that. And then, of course, I can pass that on. Or nowadays, you don't pass it on, you don't make it.
But you see, there wasn't, the Egyptians are right, because there wasn't any need for the ETs to do that. I mean, they got the Baghdad battery, which is basically like plugging an amp meter into a lemon. You know what I mean? It was a copper rod inside acidic substance with tar insulation that generated voltage. People just don't know those things are there. A certain amount of evidence that they had light bulbs, they had aeroplanes, they certainly had drilling technology. There's a good chance they knew how to put up hot air balloons. They had ocean-going ships. Their metallurgy was off the Richter scale. What they knew about things like that is they knew more then in their world, perhaps, than we know in ours now. But that's these guys with the enormous heads.
Do you
That's
think
the big brain fellas.
Now, do you think that that's where kind of like where the rapture comes in, where a lot actually these ET ships come down and picked up these hybrid people and they were part of their race and they went back to their another home planet somewhere? Uh, you know, I'm kind of changing my mind, Mark. I like talking to people like yourself. I'm an ET person. I'm an experiencer, and I've written
Yeah,
books.
yeah.
But now I'm looking back in history, and I'm thinking, okay, history's hidden from us. These people were a lot smarter than we thought they were. And also you talked about the crystal skulls.
Yeah,
Those had to be diamond drill bits to make those things.
yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean the Mitchell Hedges skull is the prime example. I mean that's been under an electron microscope,
Mhm.
and when that was examined, there's no manufacturing marks on it anywhere. So either they made it with something that the was like a laser or something and didn't leave any marks, or they knew exactly how to get those manufacturing marks off the skull.
Mhm.
You know, they clearly what they could do with stone, and this is obvious from Egypt, the things they were capable of doing with stone was light years ahead of anything that we can do. They were shifting blocks that we don't have the technology to move.
Yeah,
They were
100 tons and stuff. Yeah.
yeah. And some of the carvings, I mean, this is big on the internet at the moment, so this is current. They're looking at the Egyptian carvings, and they look like they were carved with lasers, laser precision. And some of the glyphs, the hieroglyphs, are absolutely identical. If you get the same glyph appearing several times over, and how do you drill through, an entire rock face, the same hole all the way through, things like that. I've in real life, I've actually looked at the carving, the drilling, and the moving technology in Egypt. I actually went out there and had a look at some of it, and it's way off the scale. It's just unbelievable what they were, capable of producing.
Just like
Absolutely
Central America,
incredible.
like in Central America, who was it?
Yeah,
The Spanish went there and conquered, the Mayans and
yeah,
destroyed a lot of their information. And
yeah.
actually, the high priest went to who was it? Who was that? The captain or the leader of the Spanish.
Cortez, conquistadors.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the main, I guess, elite priest that he told him, he said, don't destroy all this stuff. This
Mm,
has to do with humankind. This has to
yeah.
do with human history. And then the Spanish said, no, it's evil. We're going to burn it. So they destroyed most of it. They did get a few of those tablets, and that's where they got in 2012 was supposed to have the end of the world come up.
Mm,
With that calendar, the Mayan calendar. Uh, but it's the same thing that happened there. People just they reverse history or they wipe out
mm.
history because they think it's evil, they think it's bad, technology is bad. So yeah, that's the same, in the same vein.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk to you about Tartaria, and I know
Yeah.
you have a different look at that. Why don't you go with that, Mark, and tell us a little bit about Tartaria?
Okay. Well, on the upside, looking at it from a positive perspective, yes, it appears on maps. It's there, southern Russia. It's on the old maps as an area, Tartaria. Yes, there was a race of people that inhabited that area. So your history there, in terms of physical history, yes, it's got loads of that. It is a really mysterious, area of the world to go to. But then, if you look at it as a modern day phenomena subject, Tartaria, most of it's nonsense. Most of it's made up. There's an awful lot of photographs out there. They show buildings with buildings underneath. No, they're not buildings underneath. That's foundations. That's what they look like. They show all kinds of peculiar geology, weird geology in that, which is, misappropriated. The geology exists, things like that are real, but they're just using it for other things. So every time, it really annoys me, it frustrates me. Every time I see anything associated with Tartaria, it's usually nonsense. It's AI, it's CGI'd, it's made up. It's not what they're claiming it is. In the last couple of years, it's really since lockdown, Tartaria as a concept has ballooned. But it doesn't have the support and backing that things like Atlantis has. It's not got all that research and that, but it is becoming a vehicle for the new nonsense. For the new misinformation, the new rubbish seems to be coming through that label. Um, I have spent some time looking into it. I've looked at the evidence. I get stuff sent to me all the time, and I'm not seeing a lot of substance. It's all smoke and mirrors to me, most of it.
What about the World's Fair? Like here in St. Louis, 1904 World's Fair, they built a bunch of buildings, and one of them was a mile long
Yeah,
building, and it was very beautifully designed the way the pictures show it. But then after the World's Fair, they tore all that stuff down.
yeah.
Why would they do that? Mark, could you come up with
It's well, it's you've got to kind of understand the Industrial Revolution and the Victorian Empire mentality, and that's how the world operated. Well, they did that the same way that they built pyramids and all these other amazing structures. If you've got all the time in the world and you've got a decent reason to do something, And there are no televisions, there are no social media, no telephones, no, none of that. Forget all of that. Because we're going way, way back, when people knew how to work together and knew how to do things. I mean, over here in the UK, we had Crystal Palace, the biggest greenhouse ever built. They chucked that up for an exhibition. That was for the World's Fair. So they could do that. They could put things up really quickly using the latest industrial technology. But then a lot of these things didn't hold any value. They were put up purposely for that reason. I mean, Crystal Palace over here burnt down. Like you say, the World Fair was dismantled. The site was used for other things, etc., etc. Anything before the Second World War, so anything sort of late 1930s, 1940s, anything before that, and you're relying on old industrial revolution technology. So they're going back, and they built on an enormous scale. So what Tartaria is basically, Tartaria is to archaeology and history what steampunk is. Steampunk is a recent phenomenon. That's what steampunk is to art and creativity and imagery. They've just done the same thing. They're looking at all this stuff from the past going, wow, that's absolutely amazing. Was it this, was it that, was it the other, can we do this, can we do that, can we do that? History, stick to your history. The fact that there's photographs of things like the World Fair, there's photographs of things like Crystal Palace and that, it is very kind of steampunk. You're looking back to that era. You're looking at all the, even the cameras that they were taking the photographs with. That's early industrial revolution technology. It only began in the 1840s, 1850s. First photograph, I think, was taken in the late 1830s in France. So you're dealing with very early technology there. That has opened up the floodgates to what we're seeing now. They're going back to those old glass plates and what have you, and they're just churning more and more of that sort of thing out. And it's annoying because it's muddying the waters. If you're out for truth, if that's your aim is to try and get to the bottom of things, I'd take the whole Tartaria thing. I'd just go park it somewhere. That is going to take you down the wrong avenue, I think.
Yeah, I think somebody else. There's some other rumors going around with Tartarians that the people that you see, the construction guys in these pictures, they're only about 5.5 feet tall, 5'10", smaller guys. And they said they're the ones who built all these big monuments and then tore them down. But then they said what was hidden from view and from us, there were giants that built these buildings.
But you
That's
see, it's easy to make that kind of thing up.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
just it. That's what I mean. And the whole idea. I mean, this was another piece of misinformation that back in medieval times, people were tiny. That's the reason why all the doorways are small. They were all like 4'6". That is complete and utter nonsense. I've excavated the grave of a knight, and the skeletal remains indicated this guy was 6'6". So it just things like that. People just make stuff up. They weren't necessarily any different, 100 years ago or 200 years ago, even 300 years ago. They weren't any different from the way we are now. They
No,
were just as diverse.
we got short people, we got medium
Yeah,
people, we got
yeah,
large people. Uh,
yeah.
I just grow the other way. But I'm not a
Well,
libertarian. I'm a
yeah, a,
large
a, a large Aryan. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, going spreading out. Yeah,
But no, it's interesting looking back on
yeah.
all because we're hearing so much stuff that's being hitting from you mentioned. Here's two other things I want to mention before we get out.
Hmm?
We're talking, this whole conversation has been about history and where it's been wrong, and what we're trying to do is correct it through technology that we have now, and also hindsight. Uh, Now, the firmament, I think you mentioned that before. Is there such thing as a firmament around the earth, Mark?
I believe there was. What's interesting, and this is science. If you look at the fossil record and the fossil world, and then you look at what was going on pre-flood, it looks very much like we were living in a greenhouse. Okay, so that would point towards there being more water vapor in the atmosphere. So, I mean, even the conspiracy theorists, people are saying, hey, they're doing cloud seeding. They're trying to do chemtrails to bring the clouds back, to put more moisture into the atmosphere so we don't get cancer and we don't get microwaved by the sun and this, that, and the other. The background to that is this idea that in the past, that's what life was like. It was like a huge greenhouse, which certainly in the Cretaceous period, if you want to go back to these periods, and possibly the Carboniferous as well, the plants, the animals, everything was just, it was like living in a greenhouse. That's what it was. What went wrong with the flood is that layer, that protective layer up in the Earth's upper atmosphere, collapsed. That's where all the extra water came from. That's the only way that you could get the quantity of water that we've now got in the oceans, frozen in the ice and trapped in the atmosphere. You total all of that up, and you've got a major problem because you've got more water than is practical. That water barrier, that outer layer, if you like, that is referred to as a firmament. That is where the firmament used to sit.
Hey, people,
It's more,
I want you to listen to what Mark just said. It's to me, I've never heard it, said that way, but that it's very
yeah,
scientific, very scientifically possible.
yeah.
Thing.
Yeah, well, the flood, the flood is the collapse of the firmament. That's what the flood is. Then, of course, post-flood, you get the rainbow, which is water vapor in the atmosphere. So you start then for the vapor to go back up again. It's starting to evaporate. It's leveling itself out. So that particular flood, we can't be certain what triggered it off. Probably not a meteorite. I don't think it's a meteorite that triggered that off. But the collapse of the firmament, that is a kind of a known thing. That's it, that's the effect it would have. And when you look at the dinosaurs and things like that, it's very clear that a lot of them were trapped in a flood. Something came down so fast and it froze so quickly. It froze mammoths still standing up with the food in their mouths. It literally, wham, it just froze them exactly where they were. Flash froze them. And there's an awful lot of water involved in the creation of fossils. I have to say that. Geologically speaking, it's a very broad sweep of the brush. There's lots of different processes create, fossils, but certainly all the organic remains we've got and what have you from those periods, the fossil record, it's all to do with water. They're all trapped in a moment, in an instant. So there's a lot of science to back that up. People can go and check that out, But firmament, what we're left with now, of course, is the Van Allen belts. We've got the inner Van Allen belt, the sweet zone, and then the outer Van Allen belt. That's what most people nowadays would view as the firmament. If I was a betting man, I'd guess that the moisture was probably in that sweet zone, between the two belts. And it's not there now, it's gone. So we are living in a dramatically altered world, which is the reason why everything is smaller. When people say, why don't we get, dragonflies the size of helicopters, and snakes that are, bigger than 2 double-decker buses and all that. Well, it's because the planet won't support something that's that scale because it's lost its greenhouse effect. It's lost that protective layer.
Key is oxygen, I've heard, for enlarging people. But let's don't forget, I'm not going to forget my ET friends, okay? The ETs come through that firmament because they were able to come through portals and come through, their own way, how they get here. And
yeah, well, as I said earlier, the latest opinion is that they actually don't need to, that they're actually coming in through from another dimension.
Yeah.
So they don't physically have to come through anything like the Van Allen belt, etc. Back to this idea of things bobbing in and out of our atmosphere, and having to fly around and dodge debris and dodge meteorites and dodge all this. No, they don't have to do that because they're actually living parallel somewhere else. That's the latest thinking, that they're bobbing in and out. So you're right to say things like portals, and interdimensional connections and wormholes and whatever. That's how they're doing it. That's how they can pass through solid objects and appear and disappear and all this kind of thing, because what we're dealing with is something that's operating on a wavelength that we're not even aware of. I think I'm right in saying it's 0.0035% is all we get. That's all we can actually perceive of light, sound, wavelength. That's all we're experiencing. Outside of that, of course, is the rest. So 99 whatever percent we're not aware of. We're not built to experience that, and that's where these things are coming from.
I love the way you define the firmament, because that's been stuck in my head. And then thing, they're shooting rockets up, and they go in an arc and they come back down because they can't get through the firmament. Well, the firmament's not there no more. That's why they're able to travel to the moon. Okay, in closing, we're
I'm glad you moved swiftly on at that point,
yeah.
because my opinion, as you know, is nothing gets out of the outer Van Allen belt because it just gets destroyed by it. So that's the reason they come back.
Okay, now you mentioned the moon as being a satellite.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's briefly just talk about that. What's your opinion on that, Mark, on the moon?
Well, it's very clearly stuck in the gravitational pull of planet Earth. You know, nobody would ever argue with that, and it's stuck in such a way that it always faces the same way.
Mm.
So it goes round the planet, and we always see the same side of it, hence the dark side of the moon. So we see it stuck on. Whether or not we can actually get to it and then interact with it, that is an entire program just on on its own, which I have done. I mean, I've done it once or twice. It's not a subject I'm well known for doing. I yeah, I'm not a great believer that we can get outside of the Van Allen belt.
What
It
about the
just
moon?
happens.
What about the moon
Yeah.
is ET base? That's the rumor conspiracy is going around.
Well, yeah, that it's a fake planetoid. You know, hey, look, we've got the Death Star stuck up there. Um, no, I don't think that's the case. I think it's what happens when enough debris gets stuck on the planet. And it clearly it's part of our particular historical time period. It's to do with our survival and our structure, because the fact that it's there gives us the tides, you know, it affects the gravity, it gives us our climate, it gives, you know, so much to us just by being stuck there. But it's so precise in its positioning, in what it does. You know, you can't, you've either got to say, this is the bottom line, you've either got to say, okay, the entire of nature, everything we see is a well ordered structure, or by hell, we're lucky and the whole thing's random, you know, which I don't go with that. Chaos does not produce order. You know, it's the other way around. We start off with order and it generally decays into chaos. And I think the moon is part of that order. So, in a sense, you know, dare I use the word creation? You know, if we're created, if it's a giant clock, part of the universal clock, then it's there for a reason. Um, how it was made and when it appeared there, you know, like I said at the very, very beginning, it perhaps when the planet was forming, it was knocked off the bottom of the planet, and that's where it ended up. So we've kind of got some idea of how it ended up there and how perhaps how it was made. But I still don't think we've got a good handle on it. I still don't think we know what it is. I'm not so sure it's an alien base. It wouldn't surprise me if it wasn't hollow.
Yeah,
Some
that's
people
what
have
I was
said,
going to ask you because
yeah, well, when they've hit it with things, it rings. You know, it rings. That wouldn't surprise me. That might be part of the reason why it stays where it is and does what it does, because it isn't a planet. I said that at the beginning. It's not a planet. It's not even a planetoid. You know, it's stuck on. It's part of the way that we operate. You know.
wow, this has been an interesting conversation, and you have really, you know, got my mind, and just like the other guest had, they talked about humans being very intelligent that
Yeah.
didn't need ETs, and you're talking about the ancient people that were here, and you're talking about the firmament, and I that's the first, I mean, a very logical, you know,
Yeah.
what you just said about the firmament is very
Mm.
logical. I mean, it sounds like yes, and also I guess in ancient times here's another one last comment we'll see about the
Yeah.
they said in ancient times that people said that we didn't have a moon. The moon only come into view some what 100,000 years ago or whatever. What about that rumor, Mark?
Well, the two factors there obviously are based on the evidence. You know, either A, it was part of the planet functioned perfectly well with it stuck on the bottom, you know, before it got knocked off. So clearly, at some point, you know, science seems to indicate the moon wasn't there. You know, how recent and whether anybody was there to see it happen is a different debate. You know, that's an entirely different factor. But then you've also got this thing where if there was a firmament, if we were an enormous greenhouse, you might not be able to see it. You wouldn't know it was there because you couldn't see beyond, you know, that big sort of cushioned layer, the firmament that was stuck onto the planet. When that disappeared, you know, all of a sudden everyone was like, oh, blow me, I didn't know that was there. Whoa, all of a sudden we've got a moon we didn't know was there. But then that does raise other questions again about dating and stuff like that. At what point did all these prehistoric monuments start to be aligned to the heavens, to the stars? There must be a point at which those alignments stop if you couldn't see the stars. That's a real, turning point, if you like. Where all of a sudden, instead of us all being happy and joyful and Garden of Eden, you can eat everything, go everywhere, it's perfectly safe. Living in this big cushion greenhouse, so it didn't matter. All of a sudden, it starts to matter because we need to know when the next big thing is going to hit us. Where are we in the universal clock? So then the focus changes, everything alters, that firmament disappears, and all of a sudden we become obsessed with the stars. So clearly that is a distinct change in human development. So, if you want to get biblical, it's the point at which they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. It's funny how they say there was an angel placed at the gate of Eden with a burning sword, a fiery sword, so that none of humanity could ever get back into Eden again. Supposing that is a metaphor for something like a giant meteorite impact, big atomic burning column where this thing's plowed into the planet. You're not going back to Eden because you ain't getting past that. And then from that point on, everything changes. Instead of it being nice and idyllic and everything's laid on and it's dead easy, and life is beautiful, all of a sudden it goes to atomic winter. It gets really harsh. Everything goes cold. 2/3 of the contents of the planet die. The species start dying. That is more likely to be what we're looking at there. That's the kind of turning point. And most people, I think, would agree with that. Most scientists would agree with that.
Recycled, reset, whatever. Mark Olly, tell us where we can find you on the internet and some of your books. And
okay, dead easy. I always do this. It's really simple. I don't do complicated. Forget it. I don't do complicated. If you want the books, there are 9 of them. You'll find them all on Amazon. So go and, do a search, my name, see what comes up. If you've got the book title, fabulous, you'll find it pretty well straight away. So that's Amazon for product. If you want to find me personally, I'm literally only on Facebook. You can come and friend me on Facebook. So as long as you haven't got Fifi Trixabel as your name and a unicorn and clouds, and I haven't got the foggiest idea who you are, in which case I won't friend you because you could be a truck driver from Birmingham for all I know. I'm not going to friend you if I don't know who you are. But if you're a real person, I will accept you as a friend. I'm really not that fussy. So come and find me on Facebook. You can talk to me on Messenger as well if you do that. And then I would advise people, if you really want to know more about sort of what I'm about, do a search on YouTube. Go and type my name into YouTube and go and see what you can find. There's a ton of stuff out there. I put all my back catalogue up on YouTube last year. Type in Lost Treasures and me, and you'll just get loads of stuff. You can spend a happy afternoon wandering around YouTube. So that's it, really. You've got Amazon, Facebook, YouTube.
Great.
Off you go.
Olly from the UK. I enjoy your company and I enjoy what you're saying. And you made a lot of sense in what you're saying. We must listen to reasoning. We must listen to common sense. And what you have is a common sense approach. And the firmament was wow, great explanation. I like that. And also the ancient civilization was smart enough to do their own thing because we've actually lost intelligence actually in the past 1,000 or so years. So, okay, Mark Olly and Dave Emmons, A Strange Reality. We want to thank everybody for listening and watching. And Mark, maybe have you back someday soon because you got so much. I still haven't tapped your brain all the way yet. So there's so much more in there. I mean, you surprise me every time I talk to you. And this was just a real chat right on straight through. And I like it that way, where we can just unplug ourselves and do the acoustic version of the conversation, as we say as musicians. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mark Olly, for being on the show. And thanks everybody else for listening. Thank you. Good night.